It's the show where Hawaii's newsmakers come to talk and to take your questions live. From the nation's capital to Honolulu Hale, from the state legislature to the fifth floor. We bring the experts to you and ask them what you want to know. Spotlight Hawaii with Yanji Denise and Ryan Pelesuji on the digital platforms of the Honolulu Star-Advertiser.
This episode of Spotlight Hawaii is brought to you by Long's Drugs.
Well, aloha, and thanks for tuning in here on this Aloha Friday. I'm Ryan Pelesuji, joined by Yanji Denise, and this is Spotlight Hawaii on the digital platforms of the Honolulu Star-Advertiser. You know, we've made it to another end of another week, and there's been a lot of topics that we've discussed this week as well as throughout our time here in Spotlight Hawaii. But one of those topics that we continue to bring up and spot shining a light on is what's happening at Red Hill and those who have been impacted.
That's right. We've spent a lot of time speaking to the military and those in leadership from the legislature, all the way, of course, to our congressional delegation, talking about how the Navy is going about defueling the tanks and what is to happen after that. We have not spent that much time, though, talking about the families themselves, those who've been impacted. So we've invited a guest on who is really involved with those families and trying to bring what she calls justice to them. Please welcome Kristina Baehr from Justwell Law, based in Austin, Texas. You are representing 1,800 plus families or individuals who are affected by the fuel spill. Tell us a little bit about, how this lawsuit came about and who you're representing.
So how it came about is a woman named Jamie Simic called me from her hospital bed and said, "I've been poisoned. Can you help?" And my own family had experienced toxic exposure, and there had just been a CNBC story about my family. And someone saw my story and gave her my name and my number on a Post-it note. And she called me, and I flew over to Hawaii, and I met her, and I started meeting others. And it was a case against the government. And I had just worked for the government. And it was a case about toxic exposure, which is what I was focusing on. And I thought, yes, I can help. And yes, I can do this. So that's how it started. It started with one client, Jamie Simic, and now we represent 1,800.
Tell us a little bit about the lawsuit specifically, what some of the claims that, those who have been impacted by what happened at Red Hill are seeking and what the general goal, I guess, is of this lawsuit.
The Federal Tort Claims Act allows you to bring a claim against the United States for negligence. Basically, if you've been harmed by the negligence of a federal officer, you can bring a claim against the United States for the harm. It's a beautiful thing. Not every country has that, but here we have that. And that means that people who are harmed here by the negligence of federal officers can bring a claim to the United States for the harm. So that's as basic as it gets. Our clients want accountability. They want to make sure that this never happens again. And they want compensation for the harm.
Tell us about some of those harms. 1,800 certainly is a lot of people, although we know up to 93,000 people were affected by what happened there. What are some of the impacts that have happened for these folks?
Well, the most important one is health, right? I mean, this has destroyed many of them physically. I have clients who have been to hundreds of doctor's appointments in the last year, not just themselves, but for their family members. And so you can imagine if a sick family is sick, the mom is sick, and she's trying to take care of kids who are also sick, while also trying to work and support the family. So we have a lot of very, very sick families who are struggling to get the care they need. And one reason they're struggling to get the care they need is because they had to go to the government for the care, because many of the people affected, not everybody, but many of them are military families who get health care from the military. So imagine a situation where, if you were poisoned by Exxon, imagine where you had to go to Exxon to get medical care. That's what happened here. The Navy poisoned these people, and then they had to go to the Navy and to the Army and to the military to get care. And care for a lot of people were denied.
There are, of course, these instances where people were obviously suffered medical conditions, but there are other ways in which people have been affected by this. Are those also included within this lawsuit?
Absolutely. So we think about this in terms of inconvenience, illness, and fear. Those are the three categories of damages that you can get for a case like this. And think about it, every single person on that water line had their life disrupted in some way. Pets died. They had to move out of the houses. Then they had to move back in the houses. Those houses were never cleared. They were never appropriately remediated. So when they moved back in, many of them got sick again. Then they spent their life savings to get off the island, to move back to the mainland. I mean, the disruption to life is extreme for so many of these families. And then you have illness, which we just talked about. And then you have fear. And under Hawaii law, fear is a claim in itself. You can bring a claim for the fear of future harm. And we know that these families are going to be at risk of future harm. They're going to be more likely to get leukemia. They're going to be more likely to get heart disease, lung disease. And we have seen that at Camp Lejeune in North Carolina. So our clients are looking at people in Camp Lejeune and thinking, who's going to die first, me or my kid?
That is just a horrible thing to think about. I'm interested because some people watching today who are not part of that 1800 may think, well, I lived there, but I didn't get sick. I'm healthy now. Crisis averted. I'm okay. What do you say to those folks about why it might be a good idea to speak to you or another attorney about potential harms?
So great. That's such a good question. You have to bring a claim now, because your claim's going to expire 2 years after the event, which is going to be December. So you can't wait until you get sick to bring a claim. And this event put you at risk of harm, at risk of future harm, and then, of course, the disruption and inconvenience to your life. So you have a claim right now, whether or not you're sick, and you have to bring it right now. So you don't have to hire me. I'd love to represent you. But find a good lawyer and bring a claim, because you can't wait until you get sick later.
And so that's, I guess, one of the questions that people may have is, how do you prepare for that, this claim where you may feel fine, but down the line, you may be suffering some of the ramifications. You're saying essentially at this point, if there is no claim filed within this year, even if something happens 5 years from now, or you decide then that you want to take action against the government for this inconvenience, that time would have been expired and they would have no case.
That's right. So you can, have an adult who's fine now and gets cancer 5 years from now and is able to tie that cancer to this contamination. That person is not going to have a claim 5 years from now. I mean, it's troubling, but that's the law. That's how the law is designed. You're only allowed to bring claims within 2 years of knowing about the harm. So you have to bring a claim now. And I think that the claims will be significant, because even if you're not sick right now, the trauma that you experienced of being poisoned by your government, the institutional betrayal, the fear that you're going to suffer harm in the future, the fear that your kids are going to suffer harm, all of those things are very real, and I think should be entitled to significant compensation.
I think there's a difference, and this was, ignorance that I had as well, that if there's a lawsuit filed, somehow, if I'm in that 93,000, I'm somehow part of that class. We hear about class action lawsuits all the time. I know that, I personally, and I'm sure our viewers have received those flyers in the mail. You may be entitled to XYZ money because you bought a product at this store, and then you can file later and, you didn't even know the lawsuit was happening. How is this different?
That's a great question. So this is not a class action. So you're not going to get a check in the mail for $3 from Target. Like, that's not what this is, because you can't bring a claim against the government under a class action. You have to bring an individual claim. So that means that you have to bring an individual claim to the Navy and then have your name added to a lawsuit in order to bring a claim. If you don't take action to do that, you're not going to be covered. You're not just randomly covered by class actions. Now, that's true for claims against the Navy, which are the claims about personal injury. There are some claims with class actions going on against the landlords at issue here, and that's a different thing. So if you may be covered against the landlords, but you're not going to be covered for personal injury against the Navy, who's the real wrongdoer here. Because it's the Navy who contaminated the water. And then it's the Navy who didn't tell you not to drink it.
I'm sure that you have really submersed yourself into these stories and the claims of the clients that you represent. Was there anything that you discovered during this process that maybe surprised you, or that you think people would be surprised to learn about the impacts of what happened with Red Hill that maybe just the general public aren't aware of, because there may be other individuals out there who may have suffered something similarly and haven't really reconciled the two together? What maybe has stood out during your initial process of research for this case?
Well, y'all have done such good reporting. I mean, the Star-Advertiser has been right out at the forefront of all of this. And I'm sure you feel this way too, but it's been like watching a train wreck, because it's one thing that the contamination happened. And I flew out in January of 2022. So I was there right after it happened, right after the government had admitted to the blast. But watching how our own government has abandoned its people has just been heartbreaking, because we know how to do this. We know how to evacuate. We know how to clean up toxic sites. We know how to clean toxic homes. We know how to filter water. And we've done that in other places in this country, including in Alaska at the Air Force Base there. And the incompetence and the gaslighting and just the failures after the contamination are what has really struck me about this case. Because we can talk about poisoning and spills happen, and that is true, but our government abandoned these people, many of whom have given their lives to this country.
I read over the lawsuit, and the lawsuit claims that the Navy harbored, quote, toxic secrets. Tell us about what you really mean by that.
Well, there have been lots of spills at Red Hill over the years. Not all of them have been disclosed. But what we know is in May of 2021, there was a release of 20,000 gallons of jet fuel. That was not disclosed to the public. Then in November, there was, as you know, a cart that hit the PVC pipe, and there was an enormous blast. And the government didn't tell anybody again. And 20,000 gallons went right into the water source. The government held town halls in that period of time for the affected families, and people were reporting, there's gas in my water, I can smell it. And the government said, we are aware of no fuel leak, and the water is safe to drink. And Captain Spitzer in particular sent an email to all those on the waterline, at least who were in the military, and he said, my men and I are drinking the water. The water is safe. And after that, thousands of people went to the emergency room that weekend after they had been reassured that the water was safe. So that's what we talk about when we talk about toxic secrets. They said that there was no video of what happened. Oh, sorry, no surveillance footage. And then y'all know Kristina Baehr came out with the video of the blast. This was not a small leak that happened over time. This was an enormous blast that went on for 36 hours of jet fuel spewing out. And what we know now is it went directly into the water source. And the government knew that, and they had footage of it. And they didn't bother to tell anybody on the water line not to drink the water.
It's a pretty daunting when you think about some of these claims for some of these individuals having to go up against the military. And it seems like it could be a long process. It's almost like a David versus Goliath when you're going against the military and the U.S. government. How have things been perceived thus far in these initial conversations, in these initial filings? What is your interpretation of the government's willingness and the military, the willingness to settle this?
So in the lawsuit itself, we're not really against the Navy Council. We're against the Department of Justice. And I have to tell you, there are great lawyers on that side, and they are charged with doing the right thing. And I used to represent the United States in claims under the Federal Tort Claims Act. And when I was on that side, I was in their shoes, and I was charged with doing the right thing. So it's very different than going up against Exxon or some other private company. We are going up against a government and government lawyers whose job it is to ensure that justice is done. So we're just giving the government an opportunity to make it right. And the government wants to make it right. I don't see this as David and Goliath at all. I mean, I know that I'm, maybe the David of the in this characterization, and I don't mind. I love David, but I don't see this as David and Goliath at all. I see this as a government that wants to make this right, and my job is to give them that opportunity and to make sure that my clients are represented in the process, so that the government can hopefully give them the justice that they deserve. The government does not want to draw this out. And in their, the way it works is you file a lawsuit, and then the government often files a motion. Usually it's called a motion to dismiss. And they didn't move to dismiss the case. Instead, they filed a motion, and in the opening paragraph, they said, the Secretary of the Navy has acknowledged that these spills occurred, and the government is committed to resolving these claims under the Federal Tort Claims Act. That is extraordinary. I've been litigating at pretty high levels for 15 years in federal court. I have never seen a defendant admit in the opening paragraph that they caused this spill and that it harmed the community. I mean, it's just never, that doesn't happen. So that is really encouraging to me, that the government wants to do the right thing. And our job together collaboratively is to make sure that that happens as fast as possible.
Well, let's talk about what justice looks like in this case, because it isn't a class action lawsuit. So it's not like everybody gets what you were talking about, like that $3 from Target. It's not evenly divided, I would imagine. Or is it? For those 1,800 families, is each claim looked at individually? And then if there is a judgment made, dependent on the harm experienced, or how does that work?
That's a great question. I want to start by saying that my clients, for the most part, are not in it for the money. That's not why Jamie Summitt called me. They want to make sure that this never happens again. And so even just by filing the lawsuit, I think we've worked in that direction of bringing accountability and bringing this to light. And that's what they really want more than anything. There's no amount of money that is ever going to make it right for them, right? There's no amount of money that's ever going to be enough to cover that fear of waking up in the middle of the night and Googling leukemia symptoms. There's no amount of money that will cover that. But in the end, when the judge does give an award or when we settle the case, it will not be evenly distributed. It will be according to, certain criteria, depending on what the judge allows, whether people were sick or not, how old were they, where were they living, all of that, how long they were there. So there will be a variety of different criteria that the government and I will have to agree on to resolve the claims.
We know that you've worked on similar cases like this with this nature. How is this Red Hill case different from others? I know you had mentioned some of the things that you've uncovered through this process and just the the failures that you said that the military had made. But when looking at the scope of this and just the overall impact of it, how does this stack up against some of the other cases that you've personally been involved with?
Well, this is a historic case. It's the first of its kind because we're aware of no other time in U.S. history where the government was caught poisoning its people in real time. We have Camp Lejeune, we have other instances we have Flint, Washington, we have Flint, Michigan, but all of that was found out after the fact. Whereas here it was so severe that it was coming out of people's sinks. And because we live in a connected age, people were able to communicate on Facebook and in person about what they were experiencing. And then they were able to gather together, start a movement, really, hire counsel, bring me into that movement. I'm just honored to be part of it. So this is happening in real time. And that is extraordinary. These families are sick and they're fighting for accountability and justice and change at the same time. It's extraordinary, and it's an honor to be a part of it. And it's the first of its kind.
Since there are so many active duty military who were affected by this, and you'll have to, I just want a clarification on one point, which is my understanding is that active duty military cannot sue the government. So how does this work? Are there spouses who sue on their behalf, or how can this happen? And what about those folks who don't have a spouse?
So great question. First, there are a lot of civilians on that water line, and we represent many civilians. We want to represent more civilians. This is not a remedy that's only available to people who were in the military. So if you're a civilian, know that you have a claim too. But for military families, whether the service member has a claim or not remains to be seen. Stay tuned. But for their family members can always bring a claim against the United States for harm caused by the negligence of a federal officer.
We'll explain that a little bit. So if you're a military member and you don't have a spouse, you're just a single man or woman who was on this water line, can you file a claim?
I'm just going to say yes. I think you can. I think you can, and stay tuned on that.
I also want to know where we're at, just like in this process for those that have already filed the claim. We'd spoken earlier about those and your encouragement to those who may have been impacted to file that claim by the end of this year. But where are we in the process for those who have already come forward, the cases that you've already been working on? If you can sort of lay the timeline or projection of where they're at in seeking some sort of compensation or acknowledgement.
So our group is the first on file, and we have been moving as fast as humanly possible because people need relief right now, and they need financial recovery so that they can get the health care they need. My firm is called Just Well because I literally just want people to get well. So that's why we filed first. We have 100 people on file already. And then we have another 1,800 who are at various stages of the administrative process. You have to file a claim to the Navy first before you can get added to the lawsuit. But in my view, and I think the government would agree with this, our 100 people that are on file right now represent the 1,700 others that I currently represent, right? So we will resolve it all, I hope, at one time. But if we have to go to trial, I love trials. I'm not afraid of trials. I love trial. And I'm confident that the judge will resolve this fairly and early.
And I know that you said that, the financial, potential financial, claim is not necessarily motivating or entirely motivating the people that you're representing. But how does this work in terms of damages sought? Is there a dollar figure that you lay out ahead of time, or are you just trying to prove liability? How does that work?
So I think liability is already proven. I mean, I'm going to go to court and I'm going to introduce evidence, right? But if you've read our complaint, you've seen that the government has acknowledged that operator errors led to the injection of 20,000 gallons of jet fuel directly into the drinking water. And then the government sent everybody on the water line a letter that said that you were exposed to JP5. So the liability is there. It's just a question of, how much is it worth? And I ask a lot. I ask a lot of people this question. I think y'all should start asking each other this question: how much is it worth to worry about who in your family might die first? How much is it worth to have PTSD that has a physiological impact on your body? And then, how much is it worth to be Nastasha Freeman and her family that has had hundreds of doctor's appointments, and they have lung damage, GI damage, cardiac issues, neurological problems, in every single member of their family. How much is that worth? So there's economic damages, which is, the actual cost of medical care. But I think what the judge and the parties are going to have to reconcile and wrestle with is the trauma and the fear and the long-term harm for these families. This was not just a one-time small event for many of them. This changed the trajectory of their life. And again, there are people on the waterline who feel fine now, and that's great. But it also affected their lives, right? Because it's going to affect their future care and how they think about their health going forward. So that remains to be seen. I think it's going to be, I personally think it's significant. I'm going to go to the mat arguing so, but I'm not going to put a dollar figure on it for you right now because there's no amount that would ever be enough.
Well, I'm not sure that you'll be able to answer this question, but there have been a number of town hall meetings here with those who have been impacted, along with some of the leaders that are now overseeing this cleanup. And there have been some calls by those who have attended this meeting impacted by this spill at Red Hill that are asking for hazardous pay. They believe that in some regards that this is worth that classification. Have you heard anything about this and your thoughts about those, those demands for hazardous pay for these workers?
Well, I hope you talk to my client, Mandy Fine, who will go on and on to you about hazardous pay and how important it is. I hope she's listening right now. But listen, we sent Marines into these houses without any protective gear, and we told them to just run the faucets. Just extraordinary. That water was so contaminated, and they just put the faucets on, and the fumes that came out. I mean, Nastasha Freeman, my client, has lung damage, and she wasn't doing it as a vocation. She was just doing dishes in her house. So can you imagine the harm on those Marines who were just charged to go into these houses and run the water? And our experts are going to explain just how irresponsible that was. Again, we know how to do this. We have done this right in other contexts. You put protective gear on. You have GAC filters. You have charcoal. You have water filtration devices. In these cases, we didn't even change out people's water heaters. So yes, I think that everybody who worked in that circumstance should have hazardous duty pay. Absolutely. Absolutely.
We are almost out of time, but I want to, just again, for those folks who may have joined the conversation late, if you could explain the time frame of this, why it's important to file now as opposed to waiting until perhaps you may or may not experience, some effects down the line, and what next steps you advise people to take.
So there is a statute of limitations, which means that you cannot bring a claim after December of this year, unless Congress comes through with some statute that doesn't apply now. So to be clear, you cannot bring a claim after December of 2021. That means that if you want to bring a claim for being harmed by the negligence of a federal officer, you have to bring it now. And you can bring it now. And the Federal Tort Claims Act gives you a remedy. This isn't like some litigious thing. This is actually your right under the act. And the government wants you to bring claims. That's what the act is for. It's to provide compensation for people who were harmed by the negligence of a federal officer. So if you were on that water line, you can bring a claim, in my view, and you should bring a claim by December. What do you do next? You can reach out to my office at Just Well. We're at well.law/Redhill and start the claim there. There are lots of good lawyers in this fight. You can find another lawyer. But our team would be honored to represent you. We're already at the table with the government, and we hope to resolve these claims as soon as we possibly can, because you deserve it now.
Okay, Attorney Kristina Baehr of Just Well Law, thank you so much for joining us this morning and updating us on your progress and all the work that you're doing there for your clients. We appreciate it. Thanks so much.
You're welcome. And it's going to take a long time, but I'm going to do it as fast as we can, and I'm going to leave it all in the field trying.
Thank you so much for being here. Thank you.
Wow.
Really interesting to hear from her, Ryan. That's the first time we've heard her perspective, and we hope to have her on again soon as the cases do progress. If you missed any part of this conversation, remember you can always catch us as a podcast later on in the day, or watch this anytime at the Star-Advertiser's homepage or on their social media platforms. I thought it was very interesting, and that's why I asked her to reiterate that time frame. I think a lot of people may not realize that they have to file a claim by December of this year, or you're kind of out of luck. And the way that she laid out the damages portion, that you don't necessarily have to be sick now to be entitled to a claim, that you were impacted by the inconvenience, you potentially were impacted by the health effects, and then that third point, that you could be impacted by the fear of the unknown. And I have to imagine, when she was laying out some of the health effects that her clients have experienced, and all the worry, that fear is very real for a lot of the 93,000 people who live along that waterline.
Yeah, and just the overall impact, including, as you mentioned, inconvenience. We know the significant impact that it had on families having to leave their homes for months, staying in Waikiki, staying in other areas. And there was just a significant impact to those impacted by this. And it didn't only include those who are active military. Many civilians also lived on that line that were also impacted by this as well. And so her encouragement, as we heard throughout our conversation with her, was really to file that claim. And that claim process should begin now, that even though that deadline is in December, it's going to take some time to get some of those things together. And so really making efforts to do that immediately. She did also say that, it seems that the government is willing to sort of take care of this. This isn't something that she doesn't perceive that will be sort of this battle with the U.S. government and the Department of Justice to really reconcile what happened here. They do understand that there has been some significant impact and negligence on their part with this spill, and that it seems for the most part that they are looking to make things right. And so that is the hope by all those who have been impacted and those that she represents, is that this is not necessarily about the monetary contributions that they may receive, but also just about doing what is right and making sure that there's a recognition of the impact to so many people that have been harmed by the spill at Red Hill.
Yeah, and when she was laying out, when we asked her about what the potential damages would be, when she laid out, how much is it worth to have this kind of exposure, to have those kinds of questions. I mean, clearly there's no amount of money that you could pay an individual to take a drink of that water, knowing what they know now. So I think that, this is a conversation that we will be continuing on. We'll invite her on again in a few months and see how things are progressing. We appreciate all of you for tuning in this morning. On Monday, we're going to be talking with Honolulu Police Chief Joe Logan. We love checking in with the chief and seeing how it's going. They've had a lot of issues, as we know, with recruitment and the department. And so, what are his thoughts on that? How are they progressing with new classes? And also just his thoughts on crime. Waikiki, of course, has been a big focus, and Chinatown as well. So we'll get an update. We hope you do join us on Monday. And until then, have a great weekend.
We'll see you next week. Aloha.
This episode of Spotlight Hawaii is brought to you by Long's Drugs.